Since the first lecture of the semester, I've attempted to bring home for you the idea that history is, again, not just the memorization of dates and facts and figures, but rather it is a conversation that takes place over time. And we see this in terms of historiography itself, where it's basically historians debating the same event over many decades, if not centuries, and coming up with new interpretations for myriad reasons that we've been touching on since the start of the semester. Well, it's not only historical events where we see these conversations taking place, but it's also in different schools of thought. We've talked about various different periods in history and how historians fill up and create different schools. And that is a framework and discussion that we're going to be continuing here in this lecture when we start to talk about consensus history. Because essentially what is going on here is this is a group of historians in the mid-20th century who are responding to an earlier group of historians, primarily from the late 19th and into the early 20th century, the progressive historians, particularly Charles Beard. And we're actually going to continue this story next week when we talk about radical history, which is a direct response to consensus history. So in short, we really see, again, through this lecture, how it relates to these earlier times and later times, and it is all part of this story of historiography and the historical method. We're going to start here in talking about the conflict that existed between the consensus historians and their predecessors. In this case, particularly the progressive historians that we talked about, especially Charles Beard. And to begin, we're going to be talking about how by the mid-20th century, there is a notable disappearance in terms of the historian's critical gaze. And in fact, by 1948, among historians, there was a general abandonment of any sort of critique of the past. For instance, University of Chicago historian Alan Simpson wrote in 1957 that the study of history had a, quote, chastening mission. And when you look up the definition of chastening, if you don't know what it is, it's defined as being arduous, grueling. And basically what this meant in terms of the history profession was that historians needed to basically provide a story, and they themselves, in telling this story, would serve as an antidote to what this University of Chicago historian described as, quote, illusions about the perfectibility of human nature and the power of human reason to cure original sin, and that its, quote, supreme utility is to teach the limits of the possible. So what we are seeing here with these various parts of this quote here from University of Chicago historian Alan Simpson is an effort among historians here in the mid-20th century to basically say humans do not know it all. And therefore, they are not going to, even if they look at history through a more critical lens, humans are not going to be able to change society. They are not going to be able to reform the nation. So in short, much of post-war historical writing in the United States was a form of sort of counter-progressivism, as historians of this period of the late 1940s and into the 1950s sought to refute the study of earlier scholars, again, most notably the progressive historians like Charles Beard. So I want to talk a little bit about this counter-progressive history, which is again a stand-in for this consensus history. Whereas Charles Beard had described the Revolutionary era as a struggle pitting, quote, the people against, quote, the interests. And we talked about this when we were talking about Charles Beard a little bit ago. Consensus historians spoke of a more united nation. For instance, historians in the 1950s began to refute Beard's claims, arguing instead that the framers of the Constitution, rather than having self-interested economic motives, were led by more of a concern for political unity, national economic development, and diplomatic security. In other words, this consensus history attempted to produce a new interpretive framework for American history, one that focused attention on what had united Americans rather than what had divided them. And again, this goes back to the idea that these consensus historians, this counter-progressive history, eschewed, criticized any kind of reformist or revolutionary action. Basically, they were of the mindset that American history was a story of exceptionalism. That, again, things were good in this country. There was not a divided nation, as Charles Austin Beard had talked about. This nation was united, first and foremost. So therefore, I do want to say this to finish up, because one of the misconceptions of consensus history is that consensus historians sort of ignore the reality of society, particularly the existence of disparities in terms of wealth or that social classes existed. I want to be clear that none of these so-called consensus historians denied that there are disparities of wealth or that social classes existed in the United States. But they did, and this is the key, what really distinguishes them from other historians, particularly of the progressive era. These consensus historians did refuse to believe that there was a ruling class that first and foremost was concerned with their own self-interest. So, for instance, in the Charles Beard understanding of the Revolutionary Era, he portrays the Founding Fathers as the ruling class of that era. Consensus historians in the 1950s, they would reject such a notion that there is a group of people in American society who are the so-called ruling class. What I'd like to do now, after we've gotten the general understanding of what brought about consensus history and some of its primary ideas, I want to turn now to the so-called fathers of consensus history. And there are three that I want to bring up here, and we see each of them on the right of our screen here. On the top is an individual by the name of Richard Hofstadter, probably the most famous of the three historians that we're going to be talking about. In the middle is Louis Hartz. And finally, at the bottom is Daniel Boorstin. So these three historians best encapsulate this consensus historian perspective. All of them shared a tendency to view U.S. history as distinct from the troubled past of Europe. We really see that in the readings for this week, particularly the Boorstin document, where he really focuses on this notion of how different the United States is historically from Europe. But nonetheless, all three of them, again, use this kind of comparative framework, if you will. Let's begin with the man at the top of the screen, U.S. historian Richard Hofstadter. He referred in his 1948 book, The American Political Tradition, to a growing conviction about the, quote, need for a reinterpretation of our political traditions, which emphasizes the common climate of American opinion. So again, this idea of common climate, the idea of unity among the nation's citizens. Not surprisingly, Hofstadter criticized the tendency among historians since the early 20th century, quote, to place political conflict in the foreground of history. And this, again, is the notion that American history is not about conflict only. There is a lot of agreement, and that is what Hofstadter and these other consensus historians wanted to focus on. Consensus. That's what the definition of consensus is, the idea of agreement. So it's not surprising that this historical field is given that label. And interestingly enough, as Richard Hofstadter is describing his book, The American Political Tradition, this way, we also see his publisher, the book's publisher, Knopf, also marketing the book as a work of consensus history, stating in their publicity materials the following, quote, in this age of political extremism, this young and brilliant Columbia historian searches out the common ground among all American parties and factions. So again, this idea going against political extremism on both the left and the right. This author, in his book, The American Political Tradition, according to the publisher, is interested in looking for, quote, common ground among all American parties and factions. Another individual who also focuses on this idea of unity is, again, the man in the middle, Lewis Hartz. Lewis Hartz, in 1955, published The Liberal Tradition in America. And in this book, he claimed that there existed an American ideological consensus. And this ideological consensus was about the centrality of liberal ideals in America and the acceptance of these liberal ideals. Now, he attributed this fact, this acceptance of these liberal ideals, to the lack of both a feudal past and revolutionary struggles in the United States. Again, this is comparing the United States to Europe, where Europe obviously had many, many revolutionary struggles, and they also had a feudal past. America did not, and this allowed America then to have a consensus in terms of its ideology, which for Hartz was liberalism and liberal ideals. Well, similar to Hartz was the third historian that we're going to deal with here, and that is a guy by the name of Daniel Boorstin. Daniel Boorstin. In 1953, he would publish his book, The Genius of American Politics. Now, interestingly enough, even though Boorstin talks about ideology in his book, he actually disagreed with Hartz. And the reason why, and he is actually going beyond Hartz in this argument, is Daniel Boorstin suggested that Americans did not necessarily agree on an ideology, but rather they were so united that they didn't even have an ideology. They rejected the very notion of an ideology in the United States. So, in short, put together, these consensus historians were generally guided by a striding conservatism, boosterism of this nation, and unapologetic patriotism of the United States. They again would see America as being exceptional in history, in global history, in national history. America was unique. It was not a land of conflict, it was a land of unity. And that is what united these consensus historians that we just talked about. Despite classing those three historians together, I want to highlight some differences that existed between them. Now, I mentioned at the end of the last slide that the three historians shared and were guided by a striding conservatism. Now, this is true to a certain extent, but whereas we see less disagreement in terms of boosterism and unapologetic patriotism, the striding conservatism is a little misleading in the sense that of the three, Boorstin and Hartz were definitely conservative. But Richard Hofstadter was another story. Richard Hofstadter's past actually involved some sort of flirtations, if you will, with communism and Marxism. So he was really the most radical of the three. Because what we see, therefore, as a result of this more radical past was that Hofstadter, in comparison to the other two historians, never really latched on to the notion of consensus to the same degree as either Hartz or Boorstin. And in fact, comparing the three again, Boorstin, and you should really get this by the reading that we have for this week from him, Boorstin was really the most uncritical of the three historians considered the fathers of consensus history. So as a result, I bring this up. The fact that Hofstadter was probably most the liberal of the three, the most radical of the three, and Boorstin was the most consensus-oriented of the three, because what we are going to see is these two figures, Hofstadter and Boorstin, will actually clash over their writings. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to make this story of consensus history a little murkier. Again, it's not a flat-out story of consensus all around, and that's what I want to turn to now. So what I want to do is I actually want to focus on a book published by Richard Hofstadter sort of after the high tide of consensus history, which again was in the 1940s and 1950s. I want to turn to a 1968 book by Hofstadter, The Progressive Historians. Now, in this book, The Progressive Historians, he would obviously talk about the progressive historians, but he'd also talk about some of the consensus historians. And in fact, what Hofstadter does in The Progressive Historians is he criticized the first two books published by Boorstin in his as yet unfinished trilogy, The Americans. We actually see Boorstin here to the right holding a copy of one book from the trilogy, The Democratic Experience. So nonetheless, Hofstadter, in criticizing what Boorstin was doing with this series, Hofstadter claimed that Boorstin had, quote, turned his back on the basic problems of political conflict in our history, and often of social conflict as well. So what proof did Richard Hofstadter give to flesh out this argument that Boorstin was being too uncritical? Well, as an example, Hofstadter pointed to Boorstin's decision to ignore the controversy surrounding Andrew Jackson's decision to veto legislation to extend the charter for the National Bank in 1832. This was a momentous occasion in U.S. history, and it was a very volatile era in U.S. history, and this would seem to go against the notion that Americans were always unified under a single tent, if you will. This was known as the so-called Bank War of 1832. But here's the interesting thing that Hofstadter points out. Even as Boorstin ignored this very controversial and significant event in U.S. history, this Bank War of 1832, Boorstin spent considerable time talking about Frederick Tudor. How many of you know who Frederick Tudor is? I mean, you obviously, I'm sure you know who Andrew Jackson is, but who is Frederick Tudor? Well, Frederick Tudor was actually known as the Ice King. And the reason why he was known as the Ice King is he is usually noted as the individual who discovered the utility and marketability of ice. So again, this is just the kind of most blatant example where Daniel Boorstin is going to spend more time on this Ice King, Frederick Tudor, than he does on Andrew Jackson, a president of the United States. Thus, in the eyes of Hofstadter, rather than showing that conflict did not exist in U.S. history, these authors, like Daniel Boorstin, simply offered a selective portrait of America's past. They chose to ignore conflict rather than actually show unity. Hofstadter would conclude as much in his 1968 book, The Progressive Historians, that, quote, in one form or another, conflict finally does remain and ought to remain somewhere near the center of our focus of attention. So again, what we are seeing here is internecine warfare, if you will, verbal warfare between these two consensus historians, Hofstadter from the more liberal radical end of the consensus school, and Boorstin from the more conservative end of that school as well. Another theme that we've talked about this semester, and actually we'll talk about a lot more towards the end of the semester, is this idea of presentism. And I've defined this in the past as the idea of how the present impacts historians' understanding and interpretation of the past. And we definitely see a high degree of presentism in consensus history during this period. Because in many ways, these consensus historians were responding to a plea made by one of their colleagues, the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. In 1949, Schlesinger had written a very monumental and significant book known as The Vital Center. And in The Vital Center, Schlesinger introduced the concept of the vital center, hence the title of the book, as you might have figured out here. Well, nonetheless, the vital center is defined by the book's author, Schlesinger, as existing between extremism on both the left and right. So again, this idea of eschewing extremes and seeking consensus and unity in the middle. Now, interestingly enough, for Schlesinger, the vital center was liberal democracy. So this is very much in line with what Louis Hartz will say later on about America being a predominantly liberal nation ideologically. Now, it is also important to note that when historians wrote their books, that when these historians, these consensus historians, wrote their book in the mid-20th century, the United States itself was at its high tide. It was experiencing economic abundance, political stability, and domestic tranquility after World War II. And this no doubt colored these historians' understanding of the past. Ensconced in such an environment, These historians search for the origins of America's essential liberal, democratic, and homogeneous character. In other words, they were placing the present onto the past. If the present was an era of relative calm and consensus, they believed that the past was the same way. Now, once again, there was not widespread acceptance of this notion of consensus. And in fact, what we are going to see is another historian by the name of John Higham. John Higham is pictured on the bottom right. I should have mentioned earlier too, we see on the top there Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who I mentioned earlier about Vital Center. But the individual on the bottom right, John Higham, will be what I describe as sort of a lukewarm critic of this consensus. And I'll explain what that means in just a minute here. But first, his critique of consensus history. So the historian John Higham wrote in Commentary magazine in 1959. And Commentary magazine was sort of a highbrow magazine when people still read paper newspapers and magazines. Commentary was one of those that was read by a lot of important and significant people in American society. So nonetheless, in 1959, John Higham is writing in Commentary magazine. And he described consensus history as, quote, a massive grading operation to smooth over America's social convulsions. So clearly with this quote, the idea that these historians are flattening out history, which is so interesting, but yet they're claiming that unity existed, there was no conflict, there was no disturbances across time. This was troubling for John Higham. But at the same time, I want to note this, because when, and we're going to talk about this topic next week, when radical historians in the following decade excoriated and criticized consensus historians, Higham, at least privately in letters to and from some of these radical historians in the 1960s, he chastised them for their harsh criticisms of some of his colleagues in the history departments across the United States. So that's why I say he is definitely a critic, but he is not going to go as far as some of the radical historians of the following decade that we're going to be talking about next week. But nonetheless, from this lecture, what we see here is in fact consensus, yes, but also disagreement. So it is definitely a school of thought, but it is not necessarily a general attitude among all historians. There is disagreement, as we saw in some of the stories that I've talked about in today's lecture.